Evolution is the name of the game for human beings. We develop in order to survive and adapt to our surroundings. If we don't, we'll end up like the unfortunate creatures that died out slowly because they couldn't deal with the changes quickly enough to save themselves. We used to carry arrows and scrawl fanciful pieces of art on cave walls. Now we carry smartphones and tumble over things when we don't look where we're headed. Human beings does, in fact, improve over time. Take a look around your home. 100 years ago, there were no fridges or microwaves or hair dryers, and very rarely did someone have a bathroom, let alone 2 or 3. Your medicine cabinet wouldn't be filled with Advil or Tylenol, but over-the-counter heroin or mercury. Watch on to see some of the things that were the norm in 100 years ago. Being ugly was considered illegal. What do you mean? Yes, you heard correctly. That wasn't a dark joke. 1 century ago, public officials in several major cities in the United States felt it was a brilliant idea to make it illegal to be ugly. Take, for example, Chicago. According to the Chicago Tribune, James Peavy felt he could no longer stand watching other people's misfortunes in 1881. So the fellow with the strong beauty requirements introduced an ordinance, banning people who were injured, wounded, mutilated, or in any manner deformed, so as to be an unsightly or ugly object from being on the streets of the city, where they could disturb someone. You would ask to pay a fine if you were considered too ugly to be seen in public. If you do not pay, you will be sent to the poorhouse. Since the First World War, as veterans returned home with missing limbs and horrific scars, public opinion against the ugly started to shift, but laws against unfortunate-looking remained largely unchanged and continued to be enforced until the 1950s. This rule was not officially removed in Chicago until 1974. Fat shaming is a new example of this heinous mentality toward people's appearance. The only saving grace is that no one has had the courage to consider turning this into law. Cigarette ad claims to make your head spin. It was usual for doctors a century ago to ignore the dangers of smoking, yet another reason to be grateful we weren't born during those years. In fact, some tobacco advertisements were practically optimistic. For example, one commercial told smokers that cigarettes provide temporary relief of asthma paroxysms. These commercials also included people who seemed to be doctors, and made ridiculous claims like, 20,679 physicians agree that cigarettes are good, or an eminent scientist writes, that cigarettes aren't as harmful for you as a glass of wine. Nevertheless, given both of these claims, these doctors and scientists have still remained anonymous. The motives behind tobacco makers' unsubstantiated claims and misinformation are thought to be particularly insidious. By the early 20th century, the public began to catch on, which is quite a natural development, when consumers begin to see that a product seems to be associated with people dying. What makes this even worse is that the charade continued until the 1960s, when the Surgeon General finally released a definitive warning that smoking can kill. Knockeruppers versus alarm clocks. Of all the modern inventions we rely on in our daily lives, the alarm clock is probably the most universally despised. Its jarring warning jangles jolt us uncomfortably out of our slumber and back to reality. And yet, however annoying alarm clocks are, they're also indispensable in getting us out of bed. That raises an interesting question: how did people wake up before alarm clocks became so ubiquitous? Throughout the ages, even the simple act of telling the time has presented a huge challenge to humans that we've tried to solve with elaborate inventions. Out of these early inventions came a few rudimentary attempts to create a morning alarm, such as candle clocks or drinking too much water before you sleep so you would wake up early to answer nature's call. But such crude inventions were unpredictable and unreliable. In Britain, wealthier families would also employ knockeruppers, people armed with long sticks they used to tap incessantly on someone's window until they were roused. Some knockeruppers even used straws through which they would shoot peas at their clients' windows. Dresses are for everyone. Unknowingly, more often than we care to admit, we judge individuals by what they wear or how they look like. It's in our tendency, and there's nothing we can do about it. In a way, it's sort of an unwritten rule: if you want to make a killer first impression, you've got to look good. When it comes to clothing in general, most of us remain confined by the norms and principles that define our gender. It's a distinction made in the broadest spectrum possible. For instance, we often make those stereotypical color associations that relate to gender, like blue for boys, pink for girls. As indicated by most records, pictures, and photographs, up until the age of 7, gender was obviously not something that guardians gave careful consideration to. The clothes worn by boys and girls were nearly identical, indistinguishable from one another. Even some of the most famous individuals of the 20th century, including Ernest Hemingway and Franklin D. Roosevelt, had their picture taken wearing white skirts that were considered gender neutral for the time period. Many people would find this practice peculiar today and see it as feminine. However, the clarification behind why this was done the way it was is exceptionally straightforward, and it is because of practical reasons. Imagine being a parent in an era when zippers were yet to be invented, and the pants that were available were too complicated, making it almost impossible for a boy to put them all by himself. Victorian-era parents found a way out of it which was very effective. Dressing boy toddlers in dresses made the process of potty training significantly easier and much more flexible. Parents were able to change the toddlers' diapers without the need of undressing them. Just lifting their skirts up would suffice. Additionally, the flexibility of the dresses allowed them to be worn from infancy to about age 6 or 7. A place for non-compliant wives and other crazy folks. These days, insane asylums mostly exist as dilapidated abandoned structures that for some reason no one wants to transform into something practical, perhaps because of the terrifying imagery they evoke, which always seems to happen to decaying buildings that once kept their inmates in a life filled with filth and horror. In the United States, the practice of placing people into insane asylums began to lose favor at around the same it stopped placing little children in orphanages. The American Psychological Association, however, noted that in the early 20th century mentally ill individuals were largely assumed as dangerous, so if people thought you were certifiably insane, for example, you were a female, and you thought perhaps your husband's ideas were not always the best, you were shipped off to the insane asylum where you were likely to spend the rest of your, because it was more convenient than divorce. Obviously, not everyone who was placed there was in a similar situation. Some really mentally disturbed individuals were sent there too, but these asylums seemed more like places where people were sent to die, and were hardly ever conducive for recovery. Fortunately, things started to turn around with the advent of psychotherapy, and when the public began to realize that it's not a nice thing to put people in insane asylums. Between the years of 1850 to 1900, women were placed in mental institutions for behaving in ways that male society did not agree with. Women during this time period had minimal rights, even concerning their own mental health. Research concluded that many women were admitted for reasons that could be questionable. Since the 19th century, many of the symptoms women experienced according to admittance records would not make a woman eligible for admittance to a mental asylum today. Women with symptoms were later diagnosed insane by reasons such as religious excitement, epilepsy, and suppressed menstruation. The symptoms and diagnoses presented show that labeling of women as insane was done very lightly, and was influenced by social attitudes toward women. Not everyone who went to an insane asylum was a woman whose husband couldn't be bothered to divorce her. Some genuinely mentally ill people were placed there, too, but the places were really more like holes to die in than places where the mentally ill could be rehabilitated and returned to their families. Happily, that started to change with the advent of psychotherapy and with just the general realization that it's not nice to put people in insane asylums. Child labor. Child labor, or the use of children as servants and apprentices, has been practiced throughout most of human history, but reached a zenith during the Industrial Revolution. Miserable working conditions including crowded and unclean factories, a lack of safety codes or legislation, and long hours were the norm. Crucially, children could be paid less, were less likely to organize into unions, and their small stature enabled them to complete tasks in factories or mines that would be challenging for adults. Working children were unable to attend school, creating a cycle of poverty that was difficult to break. 19th century reformers and labor organizers sought to restrict child labor and improve working conditions to uplift the masses, but it took the Great Depression, a time when Americans were desperate for employment, to shake long-held practices of child labor in the United States. The Industrial Revolution saw the rise of factories in need of workers. Children were ideal employees because they could be paid less, were often of smaller stature so could attend to more minute tasks, and were less likely to organize and strike against their pitiable working conditions. Before the Civil War, women and children played a critical role in American manufacturing, though it was still a relatively small part of the economy. Advances in manufacturing techniques after the war increased the number of jobs, and therefore child laborers. The first federal child labor laws were passed in 1916, but it was only ruled to be unconstitutional 2 years later, and there would be no real regulation until 1938's Fair Labor Standards Act. While it's hard to picture young children working full-time jobs in mines, factories, and pretty much any other unskilled profession today, it was the norm less than 100 years ago. The 1900 census suggests that almost 2 million kids aged 10 to 15 were working full-time jobs. To stay up to date with our latest videos, make sure to subscribe to this channel by clicking the button above this video.